Hey there, folks. So, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest movie in the Star Wars saga, Episode 8, The Last Jedi. So, I feel I need to introduce a few qualifications before going into this film surrounding how I feel about Star Wars and specifically the sequel trilogy thus far. The first thing is that I have been a die-hard Star Wars fan for probably about 20 years now. No joke, I've got the original series on VHS sitting on a cabinet that's just off screen here. And right behind over there, I've got stacks upon stacks of books in the EU. I was mildly obsessed with Star Wars for quite some time. I played the video games, I read the EU books, I took a look at a lot of the RPGs. I was very much invested in Star Wars and that canon. And thus, when they did wipe everything away for the sequel trilogy, yes, I was a little bit annoyed, but there was also enough detritus and garbage that had accumulated in the EU, so I kind of understood why I had to get pushed away. At the same time, in order to push all that away, I wish we had gotten a better film than The Force Awakens, which is basically J.J. Abrams wanting to ape a lot of the style and tone of the original trilogy, but also not really do that much with it, not really take it in interesting directions. Now, granted, there were some great characters behind that. I like Finn, I like Rey. For what we got of Poe Dameron, I liked him. And of course, Kylo Ren, in terms of being cast by Adam Driver, one of my favorite upstart actors in the past decade, I liked what he was doing with that character. I liked the nuances built off of The Force Awakens. I saw a lot of potential going off from there, especially when you're going to introduce Luke back into the story. But I also knew that The Last Jedi was bound to be something different. For one, it was written and directed by Rian Johnson. And if you've seen any of this guy's previous movies, you know he's a visual stylist. You know he's going to make a beautiful movie. But at the same time, I was curious what he was going to be doing in the playground of Star Wars, because Rogue One showed that Lucasfilm was willing to take some real risks. And keep in mind, I liked Rogue One a lot more than pretty much everybody else who saw that. Yeah, I thought the lead was a little bit wooden, but really, between the action scenes, the maturity, and really a lot of the framing, especially in the third act, it's a movie I can entirely get behind. But when it comes to this film, in particular, The Last Jedi, I had some worries going into it. I will admit that I like Rian Johnson as a filmmaker. I did feel that if they were just going to retread elements of Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, that would be a safe bet for them, but it wouldn't exactly make for an interesting movie. But at the same time, it's Rian Johnson. At the same time, Lucasfilm knows they can take some risks. And oh boy, with The Last Jedi, they took some big risks here. To the point where I completely get why so many critics love this movie, but I also get why so many audience call-out scores are a lot more negative than I think Lucasfilm was probably expecting, especially when it comes to the whole feeling coming after The Force Awakens, we got this, especially with the backlash from Star Wars fans on social media. Let me say this right out of the gate. I think this movie is a great film. I think in terms of thematic depth and the beauty and the overall humor and style of this movie, I think it's absolutely terrific. But I also think that a big part of this review will be trying to refute some of those fan criticisms by saying, man alive, you guys did not get this movie. I get where you're coming from. I totally do, and I think this will ultimately be responsible why some audiences were so negative. They were expecting Star Wars to be comfort food, and this is not a comfort food movie. It's actually a fair bit more challenging than most Star Wars films have been up to this point, and challenging in a way that will throw an audience. So this doesn't surprise me. But let me try to explain to you why this movie is both a lot smarter and a lot more emotionally nuanced than you might think it is. So for starters, some basic plot lines. I'm going to try not to spoil much of this movie, even though I think by the time we get to certain thematic arcs, we kind of have to discuss why so many people are misinterpreting this. Now, in this particular film, it plays out like the rebels are fleeing one of their last bases. They're being pursued by the New Order, and that resistance is on one last desperate fight because now the Empire can find a way to track them through hyperspace. And thus, the rebels need to find a way to get out of that situation. All the while, Rey is actually operating on her training with Luke and discovering more about herself, discovering more about the Force and the light side and the dark side, and all sorts of interesting things will come out of that. Now let me start by saying I truly do love a lot of the acting here, because when you come to characters like Finn and Poe Dameron, while you got shades of their personality that were established in the previous movie in The Force Awakens, they become much more into their own here. And I appreciate one thing and how much these films in particular has allowed them to become more human. As in, while they do have some stock heroic traits, they're also headstrong. Or they might show moments of cowardice. Or they might show themselves second-guessing themselves, or not always coming to the right conclusion or answer. This is a movie that relies pretty significantly upon the natural progression of somebody will learn something and then take action against it, or somebody will make a mistake and then the enemies will respond. That's not something you typically see in a lot of war movies. You typically see two plans that are somewhat flawlessly executed and hit some contact with each other and then maybe kind of slide past each other. This movie, not so much. And then you start realizing how much the Resistance is losing in this movie. It's almost like you go back to Empire Strikes Back and how much the Rebel Alliance was losing in that film too. We'll get back to most of that when we discuss some of the nitpicky details. But then things start to get interesting because, as you would expect, Luke is a little bit hesitant to train Rey because he knew his experience with the past when it comes with raising a new set of Jedi, and especially his failure with Kylo Ren. And I'm not going to go into too many of the intricacies of the details here, but beyond saying that Rian Johnson absolutely made another gorgeous movie, there are some tableaus specifically set in space that are just brilliantly shot and designed here. I like a lot of the humor and the banter. It feels witty, at the same time it does feel distinctly Star Wars, even though I do wish there were points where they injected a little bit more of the Star Wars language and vernacular into it. Like, for example, you have characters who say Godspeed. There's no concept of God within Star Wars. Say, may the Force be with you. It's not that difficult. But beyond that, he does introduce some new characters that I think play off each other pretty well. Hux, I actually think, is, in terms of an Imperial General character, you get the sense that he is a little bit more than he might be assuming, especially going into Episode 9. I think they're going to do more with his character there. And then you have the Vice Admiral Holdo on the Rebel side. I think her introduction could do a little bit to be desired, but I like the arc that her character goes through, and the fact that I like that character arc will inevitably raise the hackles of some fans, and yes, we will get to it. Of course, for me, the main standouts are Daisy Ridley as Rey. I think she actually is put through a lot more of the paces when it comes to what her character motivations are, especially surrounding who her parents are, what she truly is with respect to the story, and of course the main standout is Adam Driver as Kylo Ren, where you get more of an idea. He seemed like a bit of a bratty character that might have come through as a bit of a caricature in parts of The Force Awakens, but he's allowed to play into much darker elements of maturity in The Last Jedi, and man, I appreciate the lengths they put his character through, and some of the turns there are really kind of inspired. But really, the MVPs are, again, some of the old cast. The late Carrie Fisher, sadly, she's wonderful as Leia. How they ended this movie, it does leave into question what more they can do with that character, and I'm not going to spoil. But for me, the biggest standout is Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker. I'm kind of amazed that he went along with the character arc that he went through, and that he actually signed off on it, because he was originally not really a fan of the arc of his character, and had to have things explained, but what he does with it is truly spectacular. Taking that Jedi Master, some of that oblique silliness that has always played into that side of the Jedi, especially the older and more wizened ones, but also shows the underscore of bitterness. How, as a Skywalker, even trying to revive the Jedi Order, he has failed, almost cataclysmically. And he knows it. And now it's time we have to talk about why so many fans have gotten so damn angry about this movie. Now keep in mind, there is some precedent with this in Star Wars. Most of you weren't around in the early 1980s, late 1970s when Empire Strikes Back came out. And people were angry about that movie too, because again, the Rebel Alliance consistently lost in that movie. Think about the arc there. They lost their big rebel base on Hoth. They suffered tremendous casualties. Then they burn a lot of fuel chasing in through the rest of the galaxy. It's a big chase sequence, almost like this movie was. And then, for some large point of the movie, they end up getting betrayed, and things start going wrong. And they lose the main characters, frozen off in carbonite. And Luke loses a hand, and it suffers a traumatic reveal of his parentage. This movie, it does have those moments with regards to some of that. It also pulls upon elements of Return of the Jedi, which, again, I will try not to spoil. But I can see why some people going into this movie might start thinking that they got ripped off, or they got gypped. Because they had questions going in out of the last movie. What was established in The Force Awakens? Who is this Supreme Leader Snoke character who seemed like the newest Emperor analog? What are they going to do with Kylo Ren? How the hell is he going to recover from all those injuries? Who are Rey's parents? This movie is not designed to answer those questions. And this is where I'm going to throw up a big spoiler warning right now. You've been warned. I'm stopping the scene right now. You don't want any spoilers, even accidental ones. Get out now. So right, a lot of Star Wars at its core has dealt with ideas of destiny, dealt with that specific arc, the someone who is the chosen one, the families that will bring balance or restore balance to the Force. And the fun thing about this, and this is something that I'm going to reference the prequels on, the prequels kind of reference how all that was kind of bullshit. Because keep in mind, Anakin Skywalker was the chosen one, and look what he did to the Jedi. But again, as you're going into The Force Awakens, you get the impression that J.J. Abrams was trying to reintroduce some of those elements. That mystical family. Hey, was Rey potentially connected to some form of Jedi? Was she perhaps related to Luke? And then you realize that as she gives that lightsaber, Luke's old lightsaber, back to him, give him one more chance to restore balance to the Force, do something, take up that mantle of Jedi Master, come back to the Resistance. Luke throws the lightsaber off a cliff. Yeah, and that's kind of important because at this point, this is all about what these characters have become. You have to assume that someone like Luke, he's not going to be the same hero he was at the end of the Return of the Jedi. Especially because he's been off, he's been isolated from everybody else in the aftermath of the Academy getting burned to the ground, and his certain attempt to neutralize the darkness and evil in Kylo Ren. In other words, he's following very much a similar arc to what Obi-Wan did, except he failed even then. And that's the funny thing you start to realize, is that for as much as Star Wars liked and leaned on the Chosen One narrative initially, this movie is very much taken to deconstructing it, and basically highlighting how a person like the Chosen One, in both the Jedi or the Sith, wherever they might fall, it's really an idea rooted in the vanity of vanities. And it's also a very Western Eurocentric idea when it comes to that form of filmmaking. And really, that's always felt a little bit jarring and discombobulating when you consider that so much of Star Wars traditionally was grounded in Eastern iconography. And this is a movie that does call back to Kurosawa, calls back to some of his lesser known Kurosawa films that end in slightly darker, murkier territory. There are plot lines about this movie that almost call back to Rogue One, showing that the Republic and that the Resistance and that the First Order, they all have to buy weapons from somewhere, and some people are dealing to both sides, showing that level of moral ambiguity, showing a parallel that I find really fascinating. Because at the height of both the Jedi and Sith being those archetypal figures that can either bring peace to the galaxy or bring justice to the galaxy or rule the galaxy, there's a certain amount of arrogance to that. Thinking that the Jedi are in tune with a spectral force that so many people cannot feel. And yet they try to bring that peace, they try to be that order presence, and there's a certain amount of vanity to that. Certain of holier than thou thought to it. And to some extent, if they can't win, they'll isolate themselves. Look what Ben did on Tatooine. Look what Luke does on his little island off in the middle of nowhere, off in the deep, dank regions of the unknown regions of the Outer Rim. Because he couldn't save everybody. He couldn't fix it all. And as a Force user, that rips him apart. And so when Rey comes back into the story, it's ultimately not about her reclaiming Luke's legacy, but also forging a new one, making herself more, bringing balance to the Force and whatever that might be, in terms of being the light side to Kylo Ren's darker side. And that's one thing I do appreciate about this movie. In order to reclaim the top spot in the dark hierarchy, Kylo Ren murders Snoke. Yeah, I'm just gonna spoil that right out of the gate here. Instead of that Emperor figure, which you might all expect to have so much greater depth to him, he falls prey to the exact same historical hubris. And it's kind of ingenious that Kylo Ren is the one to do it. Kylo Ren kills his master, just like Darth Vader did before him. Except for Kylo Ren, he actually twisted in a different direction. He wants to embody all of that great vanity that came from before. He's just killing off his master to take his place. And that's where things get interesting, because then you take a look at Rey's character specifically. And with Rey, you realize that she was nobody. Her parents were junk traders on Jakku, and she had Force sensitivity. She just had it. She wasn't all that special. And the whole point of it is that she knew all of that. She was never the hero that is descended from destiny. She really wasn't all that special. She really is not the hero that's going to save the galaxy, at least not on her own. And that's a big one. Because partially you can draw an immediate parallel to the other big sci-fi movie that came out this year, Blade Runner 2049, and part of that reveal of who's really special in this equation, but also because it shows to line an element of Star Wars that I really do appreciate, in that it's bringing the larger picture into place. It's showing the people who are impacted by the wars between Jedi and Sith and may need to show a part in contributing to really bring a different kind of peace to the galaxy. And that's one thing I do like, is that the characters, all in their own distinctive arcs, between Poe Dameron and Leia, and between our friend Finn and his friend that he meets up in the film, Rose, they need to be able to find their own arcs and accept what they need to do for the larger cause. Now take a look at what Poe Dameron does. Initially he starts off brash, headstrong, outright disobeys orders, causes a mutiny when he feels that his way is the best way, ultimately to help the fleet get away, achieve that mission. Ultimately what every fan of a Star Wars series expects that brash, headlong hero to do, except it often ultimately costs so much more. It's ultimately that much more damaging. And when Vice Admiral Holden doesn't tell him the whole plan, she gives him the option to say, this is our way we can get out. This is the way we can ultimately escape. And when she is forced to sacrifice her life, she ultimately has to do it because she's not doing some brash, foolhardy plan. She's doing it as one last desperate attempt to give them one last chance of opportunity of escape. Where I think most people will have their biggest criticisms of this film is Finn's arc in the movie, which ties into the whole idea of the weapons traders and the code breakers in order to disable that tracking device, whatever the hell it is. And the key thing with Finn that he goes through is that he was originally planning on fleeing outright altogether, and yet he was told, stick around, try to solve something. Working together with Rose, they go off and they try to find that code breaker, and they land on the casino planet, which really, I have to be honest, some of the CGI was not tremendously strong there. It actually got really distracting how much it may have imitated some of the style of the prequels, which did not exactly work for me. But the one thing I did appreciate about his arc is that it's working for the larger cause, even if you don't quite fully understand that larger cause, and ultimately how that self-sacrifice is not worth it in the same degree, because your skills are still valuable, and because you might be worth more as part of the unit than you are on your own. And again, that does show a little bit of contrast against Vice Admiral Holo's particular arc, but at the same time, I think there is something of a difference there. It's not like she could have hopped on one of those transports to get away, and she has to do her beautifully shot capital ship maneuver. But let's get into some of the criticisms here, because some of this is really, really stupid. And there's one criticism that's not, and I will say that for the end. Now, my personal criticisms are a little bit more technical. Again, I wasn't really a fan of the casino arc of the movie. I think it drags on a little bit too long. I think it ultimately feels a little bit clumsy at points. But hey, I get the appreciation to put some of that commentary in. What I didn't appreciate as much was Rose's character. I like what they were trying to do in sort of inserting her into that universe, but at the same time, she was ultimately a character that I felt spoke very much in terms of trying to hammer the themes very hard and very directly through all of her dialogue. There wasn't a lot of incidental contact with a lot of the rest of the movie, even in her contact with Finn. But then we have the issue of, when it comes to some of the pacing, when it comes to some of the elements of that casino planet, and Benicio del Toro showing up to be another traitor, just Lando Calrissian was a traitor. Basically, Benicio del Toro is playing Niles Ferrier. Anybody from the EU familiar with that will know exactly who I'm talking about. But at the same time, there is a root to that character. I think it's played pretty well, ultimately, for what he set out to do as that middleman, for lack of better words. But what I liked the most about this movie, and this is something that I can see why so many people won't like it, is that it's not a satisfying hero's journey. It doesn't exactly give your heroes a satisfying ending. In fact, it might actually feel a little darker, a little bit more twisted. They keep on losing more and more and more. And for a lot of people, when they then see the fact that, well, wait, you're not getting that grand lightsaber fight at the end? You do get a lightsaber fight. It's actually really good, but it's not quite what you would expect. And you then see Luke squaring off for his big battle with Kylo Ren, and it's not the Luke you would otherwise expect. Not going to spoil too much there, but oh boy, it was something. And then you see all the fanboys crying foul. Or you can have the elements that, whoa, these are force powers we haven't otherwise seen. Yeah, just like the lightning from Emperor Palpatine in Return of the Jedi was a force power you hadn't seen before. Or the fact that every force power that is used by both Luke or another person in this movie has been paralleled before in the EU. None of that surprised me. But I can see a bunch of you walking away from this saying, well, we didn't get a satisfying conclusion. Our heroes, they lost, and furthermore, their roles in order to achieve that sort of hero's arc, they seem de-emphasized. Or Luke managed to win in his own little way and made his sacrifice, but it wasn't climactic. It wasn't the sort of thing that really got under your skin. And you know what? I can kind of agree with that. This sort of movie, it is placing itself in that the big climactic scenes in terms of its deconstruction are almost undercutting themselves. A certain lack of weight because of how things will happen around and all those incidental human factors. And that you don't really have one character that gets to rise up and be the ultimate climactic, dramatic hero. And coming off of what J.J. Abrams was doing in The Force Awakens, which was so nakedly trying to ape that arc coming out of the original trilogy, seeing Rian Johnson kind of throw some of that out the window, I'm okay with that. Honest to God. But I can see why a lot of people aren't. And why I'm okay with that is the final shot of this movie. Because on that casino planet, they encounter some kids, and the kids are telling stories about the Resistance and the Rebel Alliance and what that all means. And a certain kid looks up at the sky and is placed in a specific final shot, and you realize that for as much as Luke's hero's journey might have felt something before, when you present a hero's journey that spreads across a group or a collective, an overarching feeling that it goes beyond just you in terms of delivering some level of success, when you're not just counting on the one man to save the galaxy, and that it really is a collection of others who can contribute so much more in their own way, I think that has more resonance. And I think the fact that this is emphasized and played to a younger audience that can accept and appreciate that, I think that will have more longer-term resonance. I think it opens up so many new doors for Rey, for Finn, for Poe Dameron, for those guys, even for Kylo Ren, what he did to claim his throne now in terms of what arc he's going to take. And while he might try to inherit that messianic prophecy or as that chosen one narrative in his mind, own up to the history or take control of the history as much as he wants that past to die, in reality, Rey knows that she's taking the elements of the past that matter and going forward. And that's the funny thing that I loved about a surprise cameo in the movie that I will not spoil, and how that surprise cameo confronts Luke about the legacy of the Jedi, and how that legacy is reflected in what it's meant to burn it all down, and that what it's meant to pass on that legacy and really get to the element of balance of the Force. Not just realizing the height of your vanity, but also realizing the deeper humility that can come at its root, which is something that is both more reflective of the Eastern philosophies that have always been at the core of Star Wars, but also, in a way, a lot more reminiscent of the humanistic elements that have always been at the driving core of Star Wars too. It's not a hero fantasy, not in the same way. And you know what, for Star Wars not to be a hero fantasy in the same way, be about more of the little guys? Oh shit, almost like they paralleled that coming out of Rogue One too. So yeah, I will admit this is the sort of movie that will throw audiences, because an audience going into Star Wars is not looking for this level of thematic complexity. I will get that. And again, Lucasfilms is ballsy releasing a film with this arc, especially as it seems to deconstruct and throw away a lot of the elements that were established in The Force Awakens, even though I'd make the argument they were never established all that concretely, almost throwaway in some elements, and thus I didn't have a problem when The Last Jedi managed to dispose of most of them, and because it opens up so many new possibilities going forward. I don't know what's going to happen in Episode 9. I don't. And that fills me with a tremendous amount of excitement, especially if Rian Johnson is going to make more movies in the Star Wars universe. Hell yeah, I want to see what he does. He's got the creative willpower to understand the original themes of Star Wars, its source material, and is comfortable deconstructing them to bring it into a more seamless whole. That I can respect, that I can admire. That's why I'm giving this an 8 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation. Folks, a lot of people may have been review bombing this, saying it's not nearly as good. Keep in mind that a lot of people said the same thing about Empire, and Empire is now, well, wisely held up as the best of the series. But hey, that's just my opinion. Happy to know what your guys is. Until next time, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and may the Force be with you. Always.